April 21st, 1927, 6:30 in the morning. Calvin Pruett stands on the crown of the Mounds Landing levee. When the ground makes a sound he has no name for, a low, tearing groan rising from below his boots. 2,000 men have worked through the night beside him, stacking clay sandbags in the dark while the Mississippi presses against the far side of the levee with a force no one on the dry side can measure. He is 41 years old. He has fished this river since childhood, knows its currents and its deep holding places. Not once in all those years has the ground beneath him ever moved. What happens next takes less than a minute. The levee at Mounds Landing tears open, a half-mile crevasse of dark, churning water, and the Mississippi, held back all winter, finally comes through. To understand what Calvin loses that morning, you have to go back to the river before the flood. Now, before anyone tried to make the Mississippi something it was never meant to be. Bolivar County, Mississippi. The Delta lowlands, flat country, open sky, and the river smell in every direction. The Mississippi is not a backdrop here. It is the fact everything else arranges itself around. Calvin's grandfather worked this water in the years after the Civil War. Hoop nets stretched across cold oxbow channels. Saw a buffalo fish stacked silver in a flat-bottomed cypress skiff he had built himself. By the time Calvin took over in his early 20s, the family ran 3 trotlines, each 100 feet of cotton cordage, hooks spaced 3 feet apart, anchored to the mud bank with iron weights. Blue catfish and flathead were the bread. Buffalo fish made the margin. A man who knew the river's deep holes and could read the current's eddies did not go hungry on the delta. He ran his lines from a 16-foot flat-bottomed wooden johnboat built for the slow backwater channels. 1 oar, no engine, just the river's pull and the patience the water demanded of every man working it. Summer 1926 was wet. September wetter still. By October, every tributary feeding the Mississippi ran high, and old men walked the Delta levee at sunset, saying quiet things they didn't repeat in town. Christmas Day, 1926, the Cumberland at Nashville crested to its second highest level on record. By New Year's, the Mississippi at Cairo had already broken flood stage, the earliest such occurrence ever documented. The river was building. If you want to see how the river Calvin Pruett spent his whole life feeding finally takes everything back, here's what I ask. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange. Your way of saying this reached you. Hit subscribe if this resonated, drop a like if it moved you, and tell us in the comments what you know about the Great Flood of 1927. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Back to the Delta, and the morning the Mississippi came through. Calvin had been watching the water climb since September. Through January and February 1927, the backwater channels holding his trotlines flooded their banks, and he pulled his lines east to higher ground. The levee at Mounds Landing was old, built in 1867 and never adequately reinforced. Years of ferryboat landings at its base had eaten into the embankment in ways the engineers had not addressed. In early April, 2,000 men were mobilized to sandbag the failing levee as the Mississippi crested beyond any recorded level. Calvin worked shift after shift among them. His home stood on the dry side. 72 hours without real sleep. Men carried 30-pound sacks of Delta clay up the levee crown by lantern light, hour after hour, while the Mississippi pressed against the far side with everything it had. Just before 6:30 on April 21st, the levee base began to boil, water pushing up through the packed earth from below. The men who recognized it dropped what they were carrying and ran. The Mounds Landing crevasse opened to 100 feet in the first minutes. By noon, it was half a mile wide. The volume of water coming through equaled twice the full discharge of Niagara Falls. Calvin was already running. As no man standing on that levee crown when the ground gave way beneath him would have done differently. The river did not negotiate. It did not warn. It simply arrived. 6-foot currents ran through Greenville's streets within hours. 75 miles from the break, Yazoo City stood under 10 feet of water. The flat delta country became a lake 2,000 square miles wide. Calvin's house, 2 rooms on Cypress Piers, and 30 yards back from his fishing channel, went under in the first wave. He was on the levee already, watching the water take everything. His johnboat was still tied at the bank. He waded into chest-deep current to reach it, and in that flat-bottomed 16-footer, he pulled 4 neighbors from a rooftop before it went under. The trotlines were gone. 3 generations of gear, iron weights, cotton cordage. So the hooks his grandfather had resharpened across 50 years, all beneath the current now, beneath the river that provided everything in the first place. 13,000 people gathered on the Greenville levee, the only dry ground for miles. Many stayed for days without food or clean water, standing in April heat with nowhere to go. The Red Cross came, then the newspapers, then the politicians. What Calvin noticed first was not the relief but its organization, who was loaded onto rescue boats first, and who was left waiting. He was taken to Vicksburg, where thousands of the displaced lived in canvas tents above the floodline. It was the first time in his life he had slept 10 miles from the river. By May, the Mississippi below Memphis had spread to 80 miles wide, an inland sea crossing 7 states, covering land that had been fished and farmed without interruption for generations. The floodwaters did not fully recede until August. 4 months. Calvin spent them in the camp above Vicksburg, doing whatever work was assigned, waiting for the water to release what it had not destroyed. He was not alone in that waiting. More than 700,000 people had been displaced along the lower river. The delta had lost enough of its population to empty churches, abandon schools, and dismantle communities whole. When the water finally pulled back, as it left river silt 3 to 4 inches thick over every surface, and a 65-acre lake sitting where the Mounds Landing crevasse had torn through the earth. Calvin walked back to the channel where he ran his lines. The bank was gone. New channels carved by the flood, familiar deep holes buried under sandbars that had not existed before April. He built back, not in his name specifically, but the pattern is documented. The men who stayed, who returned to the water because it was the only language they had ever needed. New trotlines, cotton cordage from the hardware store in Greenville, 50 cents a spool. New iron weights cast from scrap. New hooks for blue catfish, 5-0 and 6-0 blued wire set against the rust. The fish came back. Blue catfish, flathead, and buffalo. Species that survived this river for 10,000 years were not ended by one flood. They were in the new channels, in the new deep holes, waiting. The first time Calvin ran new trotlines in fall 1927, he worked 12 hooks in gray morning water and pulled up 5 catfish, 3 blues and 2 flatheads, the largest close to 20 pounds. He sold the catch in Greenville. Flathead brought 12 cents a pound. Was blue catfish 8. The river was providing again, in its careful, indifferent way, and that was enough to start on. What the flood permanently changed was the relationship between the river and the people beside it. Before April 21st, levees had been trusted. After, the Mississippi was something you survived, not something you owned. The Flood Control Act of 1928 committed $325 million to the Army Corps of Engineers, the largest federal investment in river management ever made. New levees, new spillways, a different kind of wall. Whole communities were permanently displaced by the infrastructure that followed. Bayou Chen in Louisiana was abandoned entirely, not destroyed by the river, but removed by the engineering built to contain it. More than 630,000 people were directly affected. The majority were African-American sharecroppers and tenant farmers, families who had worked the Delta for generations and had the least political standing to demand fair relief. The flood is usually told through water levels and politics. Those numbers are real. But behind each one is a man with a trotline and a flat-bottomed boat who never got everything back. Calvin Pruett is a composite built from the documented record. No archive preserves his name. But the trotlines he ran, from the water he read for 40 years, those things are real. A photograph survives from Greenville, Mississippi, April 30th, 1927, 9 days after the break. Water fills the street from building to building. In the center of the frame, a flat-bottomed johnboat. No one is in the boat. It floats in the current, tied to something below the frame. Just the water, the boat, and the fact that someone had not yet given up. So that is the story of the Delta fishermen in 1927. Not the politics, not the dollars. The boat, still tied. The line, already being rebuilt. The river unchanged, the man beside it returning. The last men to fish these channels the way Calvin did, cotton trot lines, flat wooden johnboats, reading current by feel, were largely gone by the 1960s. Commercial regulations had changed the gear. The Army Corps straightened the river's bends, lined its banks with riprap, and cut off its oxbows. The catfish are still there, but the water moves faster now, stripped of its old reach. The man Calvin represents never stopped fishing the Mississippi. He came back as soon as water allowed and worked the river until his hands could no longer hold the lines in cold weather. He knew no other home. The river swallowed their homes in 1927. It did not swallow them. They came back to the water because there was no life that made sense away from it. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us preserve these histories and the men who lived them. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.